Hello, everyone, and welcome to the lecture on Russian history from 1921 to 1945. This is another extremely turbulent period in Russian history. It's also one that you probably know reasonably well, so we won't go into it in much detail, but I just want to give a quick overview so that you can understand what was going on in these artists' lives and how this affected their literature and their art. And especially I want to focus on the trends and innovations in culture and art at the time. This was a very interesting period artistically, although not everyone thinks of it that way, or you might not think of it that way. But it was a very interesting time artistically, and there were many important works produced and many innovations. So, for example, the picture on this opening slide is from the ballet Krasny Tsvetok or Krasny Mak, the red flower or the red poppy, which was part of a wave of new Soviet art that was designed to inspire people and convince people of the importance and the righteousness of the Soviet cause, and also entertain them. So we will see how that progresses as the era continues. By 1921, when the Civil War was waning, the Russian economy, or the Soviet economy, now it was the Soviet economy, was in shambles. It had been destroyed by World War I and then the revolution, two revolutions in 1 year in 1917, and then the Civil War. During the Civil War, the Soviet state instituted what was called war communism, which involved forced requisition of property, especially grain and foodstuffs. By 1921, it was obvious that something needed to change, something had to be done to rebuild the economy, and in 1921, Lenin instituted what was called the New Economic Policy. This new economic policy was a step back from hardline communist economics, and it allowed a mix of both state and private enterprise. So large enterprises were mainly nationalized, but private citizens were allowed to engage in some small amounts of private enterprise. Particularly, farmers were encouraged to grow surplus and then sell it. Small business people were also allowed to do things like have hairdressers or other small businesses. And it did work. The Soviet economy rebounded, and by 1925 was in a much stronger state. And there was economic growth in the 1920s, especially in the mid-1920s in the Soviet Union. This period of comparatively liberal or open economics was also a period of comparatively liberal or open or free culture and society. The new economic policy was controversial. Many people felt like it was a backsliding or turning your back on communist ideals, but it was working. The economy was growing, and it created this class of people known as netmen, or the nouveau riche. And on the left, you can see a picture of an actor playing the character Ostap Bender, one of the most famous characters of 1920s literature from the book 12 Chairs, which you may have heard of. And he was sort of a typical netman. He was an entrepreneur who was always out for himself and always looking to make a good deal. And these netmen were sort of like today's Novaya Ruskia and oligarchy. People sort of admired them and were sort of appalled by them. Overall, this was a time of tremendous social upheaval. Women were granted equal rights under the law in 1918, and so were ethnic minorities. The Soviet state wanted to break up traditional family structures and traditional society, and so they did things like make divorce very easy to obtain. You could actually divorce your spouse by postcard, which many people did. So there were huge waves of divorces in the 1920s. There were all kinds of experiments in social and family structure. Again, the Soviet Union wanted to break up the traditional family structure, which they saw as both oppressive, which it certainly was. It was extremely oppressive, especially of women. And it also caused people to not be sufficiently loyal to the state. They wanted to make sure that people were primarily loyal to the state and not their family. So they did things like create mass childcare and encourage people to put their children in childcare starting at a very early age. This both enabled women to go into the workforce, which was desperately needed, and it allowed them to start indoctrinating children at a very early age to Soviet ideals. Art and education were considered to be a very important part of the Soviet cause. One of the most influential people of the 1920s was Anatoly Lunachorski, who was the head of the People's Commissariat of Education. And he was a very educated and in many ways very forward-thinking and artistically innovative character, and he did quite a lot to support the arts at the time. He genuinely protected lots of artists from persecution. He allowed them to publish or perform or create their art when others in the government might have stopped them. He also worked very actively to promote art and literacy for the people, and it was under him that the agitprop, the agitation propaganda trains, headed out into the Soviet countryside with artists and college students and people like that to go out and bring art to the people. So they would have these big trains that would go out full of posters and people reciting poetry and that kind of stuff to go out and bring new Soviet art to the common people. It was also at this time that they worked really hard to increase literacy. Literacy was quite low in the early years of the Soviet Union, probably about 20 or 30%. And there was a huge push for mass education. And within a single generation, literacy rose from maybe 20, 30% to 80 or 90%. And within a couple of generations, the Soviet Union had one of the highest literacy rates in the world. And many parts of the Soviet Union still have an extremely high literacy rate, higher than the US's, for example. So officially, for example, Uzbekistan has a higher literacy rate than the US still. And so this was one of the good achievements of the Soviet period, that they took a largely illiterate society and in the space of a single generation made it one of the most literate societies in the world. However, there were also a lot of extremely negative sides to the Soviet project. And this started right from the beginning. It was always a government, it was always a social experiment built on force, but it grew worse and worse during the late 1920s and the 1930s. Lenin died in 1924, leaving a power vacuum. This is a common feature of Russian history, that great leaders such as Ivan Grozny, Peter I, Catherine II, Lenin, Stalin, all died without leaving a clear successor or a clear way to choose a successor, and their deaths were followed by power vacuums and infighting. It can be expected that the same thing will happen when Putin has to step down or when he dies. That there is a somewhat clear path to creating a successor now, but nonetheless, Russia is currently following in its long multi-century historical pattern of concentrating power around a charismatic leader and then not having a good plan for replacing the charismatic and powerful leader when the charismatic and powerful leader inevitably dies. So Lenin died in 1924, and this was followed by several years of maneuvering, which ended in Stalin, who was not Lenin's favorite. Lenin said shortly before he died, like, when you replace me with anyone other than Stalin, basically. He did not want Stalin to take power. He did not trust Stalin. But, surprise, surprise, Stalin managed to consolidate power by 1928 and became the de facto head of the Soviet Union. The same year, there was a grain shortage, and between the dislike of the new economic policy by many hardline Bolsheviks and the grain shortage, the new economic policy was abandoned, and there was aggressive implementation of what they had wanted to do all along, which was the forced collectivization of agriculture. This began in 1928 and ran to about 1940. And this forced collectivization of agriculture was supposed to bring about much more efficient use of agriculture and much higher production of grain, but that is not at all what happened. It was marked by violence and mass starvation, and somewhere between 7 and 14 million people died during this period, mainly, although not entirely, in Ukraine. And the picture on the slide is of Ukrainian peasants collapsed on the side of the street from hunger in Kharkov. And so probably about 7 million people died in Ukraine alone, and then many more, another 3 to 5 to 7 million people died outside of Ukraine. Like I said, mainly from starvation. Also, many people were killed outright or deported and then died as part of the deportation. Against this backdrop of collectivization and, as we will soon learn, the creation of the Gulag system, there were also major changes happening in the world of art. And as I mentioned, during the 1920s, there was a fair amount of experimentation. The futurists and the constructivists created a number of interesting, non-realistic, and innovative pieces. But by the 1930s, there was a push to move away from any sort of experimentation towards what eventually became known as Socialist Realism. And the idea of Socialist Realism was sort of developed in the late 1920s, early 1930s, and it was officially adopted in 1934 as the required form for all Soviet art. All Soviet art had to be Socialist Realist, and this continued on until 1988. And if you see Socialist Realist art, you instantly recognize it. There's that famous statue of the worker and the kolkhoz woman in Moscow, which is from 1937. And it's most obvious in statues. You see lots and lots of Socialist Realist statues all over the former Soviet Union and places like Finland. So you can find all kinds of interesting Socialist Realist statues in Finland and sort of places near the Soviet Union as well. But it was also the official form of art for cinema, for drama, for visual arts, and for literature. And Socialist Realist art had to obey 4 things. It had to be relevant to the workers and understandable to them. So it had to be for the proletariat and something the proletariat could enjoy and understand. It had to be typical. It had to show scenes of everyday life of the people. So you couldn't, in theory, do stuff that was fantasy or science fiction or about the upper classes or in some way fantastical. That doesn't mean that it didn't happen. There was actually a lot of important science fiction that was produced in the Soviet era, as long as you had something that in some way affected or depicted the everyday people, you were able to create science fiction. It also had to be realistic. You couldn't do cubism or pointillism or something like that. It was supposed to be representational. However, in many ways, it was not actually that representational. As you can see by the statue there, that's recognizably a man and a woman, but at the same time, they're not actually that realistic. They're highly idealized and stylized. And it had to be partisan. It had to support the aims of the state and the party. And this was key. This was the most important thing. And as long as it did that, you could sort of get away with not being, or not hewing too closely to the line on the others. But it had to be seen as supporting the aims of the state and the party. And this obviously was very restrictive. And many artists supported it, but many artists, of course, did not support it. But it was already becoming obvious that it was dangerous to speak out against it. And so Isaac Babel, for example, said after it was officially adopted that the party, something along the lines of, the party has only taken away one freedom from us, the freedom to write badly. And that's one of those things that sounds like a compliment, but of course it's not. The freedom to write badly is a very important freedom. It's the freedom without which all other freedoms are kind of meaningless. And so they wanted to standardize art and literature and turn it into a production line assembly kind of a thing, which, of course, in the West, similar things were happening and continue to happen, and make sure that it was all good, that everyone was producing high-quality art and literature. Of course, what really happened is that most people produced terrible art and literature, that standardized production assembly style art and literature is almost uniformly dreadful. Some people managed to squeeze in a few masterworks, like Quiet Flows the Dawn by Sholokhov, but in general, it is considered to be pretty terrible. The other thing that happened in the 1930s in the Soviet Union was the Great Terror or the Great Purge, in Russian normally known as Bolshoi Terror or Yezhovshchina, after Nikolai Yezhov, who you see there on the left in the picture, who was the head of the NKVD during a great deal of this period. And the picture is of Nikolai Yezhov on the left, consulting with Joseph Stalin on the right in 1937 at the height of the Great Terror. And Stalin was quite paranoid, as you may have heard, and he went after all kinds of old-time Bolsheviks. He wanted to get rid of all the other major Bolsheviks from his generation. He was also very paranoid about wreckers and saboteurs and foreign spies and all kinds of stuff. And so when the Leningrad party boss, who was also his personal friend, Sergei Kirov, was assassinated in 1934, this was used as a justification for launching a massive purge of the party and the military. Kirov, there's a rumor that he was assassinated by the NKVD, what the KGB used to be called, by the NKVD at Stalin's orders. I don't think that's ever been substantiated, but that's a long-running rumor. And so that happened in 1934, and the NKVD then geared up and started arresting people. And there were huge show trials in Moscow in 1936 through 37-38, in which major party leaders and well-known old-time Bolsheviks were arrested, forced into false confessions, convicted in these mass show trials, and then normally executed. There were also lots and lots of more people who were forced into making false confessions and executed or sent to the camps, but frequently executed. So this is the time of mass executions. And thousands of party members and Red Army officers were purged from the system. Frequently, they, like I said, were forced into false confessions through torture or threats to their family. And people made all kinds of crazy confessions at the time, like spying for Japan and stuff like that, when it clearly was not true. But the NKVD was able to force them to make these false confessions, and then they were executed. So over 500,000 people, over probably 600,000 people were executed directly. And then many more, like maybe another 1.5 million probably, died in the camps. They were sentenced to hard labor and died in the Gulag camps. And I'm sure you've all heard of the Gulag, or Главное управление лагерей. And this was sort of a peculiarly Soviet institution, but not really. Of course, labor camps had been a part of Russian life for centuries. So if you remember, Dostoevsky was sentenced to 4 years of hard labor in Siberia. So they already had labor camps. And concentration camps were a major part of 20th century culture all over the world. So the British had concentration camps. Obviously, the Germans had concentration camps. Lots of people had concentration camps. And we think of the Gulag as a Stalin-era thing, and it was, but it was actually created before Stalin came to power. The first forced labor camp was created around 1923, or it sort of started coming into existence in 1920, and it was officially created in 1923 at a former monastery in the Solovetskia Islands. And there's a great book about it called Обитель. It's not translated into English, by Zakhar Prilyapin. And I highly recommend it if you're looking for something to read and you think 800 pages of epic prose about a labor camp sounds like your cup of tea. It's a fantastic book about the Solovetskia labor camp. So it started off small with just this one camp and then grew rapidly in the 1930s And by 1939, there were probably almost 2 million people in the camps. So actually a significant portion of the Soviet population was in the camps by that time. And there was kind of a general amnesty of all kinds of things in World War II, and many people were released from the camps during World War II, but many people were also put into the camps during World War II. So, for example, if you were captured by the Germans and then escaped and made your way back to Soviet territory, there was a good chance that you would be put in the camps as a spy. And if you said something that made someone unhappy, there was a good chance that you would be sent to the camps. So that's how Solzhenitsyn ended up in the camps. For example, he was an army officer. He wrote a criticism of Stalin in a private letter to a friend. It was read by the censor, and he was arrested and sent to the camps during World War II. After Stalin's death in 1953, there was another mass amnesty. But the camps continued to be used, and there's still a system of forced labor, basically, in Russia. That the camp system is much smaller than it used to be, but the basic outlines of it are still there. And it's hard to know the exact numbers of the people in the camps. The Soviet Union was not as precise in its record keeping as, for example, Nazi Germany. But there were probably about 15 or 20 million people who were sent to the camps. I think the most precise figure that many people say is 18 million. But so somewhere between 15 and 20 million people were probably sent to the camps. Probably about 1.5 to 2 million people died in the camps. But again, these are very kind of round numbers. We don't actually know exactly how many people died, or we know... When we do know who died, we don't necessarily know when and where. The record keeping was just not very precise. The Great Purge meant that by the late 1930s, the Soviet officer corps was decimated. Most of the experienced politicians and experienced officers had been purged from the government and the military. And they didn't realize how badly this weakened the military until the Winter War. And the Winter War was a very short war. It only lasted about 3 months. In late 1930, the Soviet Union invaded Finland. They said that Finland attacked them, and therefore they had to invade, and so they did. And surprisingly, no one was expecting this. They did not just sort of march across Finland and capture all of it. They met extremely stiff resistance. And although the war did end with Finland ceding some of its eastern territory, the area around Karelia, to the USSR, it was not a resounding victory for the Soviet Union. Like I said, the Soviet military was badly weakened. Their leadership was inexperienced and untrained and just missing, and the Finns were extremely motivated. There's a picture there on the slide of Finnish ski troops, and the Finnish ski troops famously were extremely effective at holding off the Soviet invasion. As the Finnish writer Väinö Linna said, it was the greatest war in the history of all wars because it was won by both sides, although the Soviet Union may have won a little more decisively than Finland. Nonetheless, both sides saw it as kind of a victory for them. Shortly before the Winter War, Germany and the USSR had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which was a non-aggression treaty. The Soviet Union had agreed to stay out of World War II and not get in Germany's way, and Germany agreed not to invade them. Well, that didn't work out, as we all know. And probably the USSR's poor performance in the Winter War made it look like an easy target. Germany probably always wanted to invade it, but its inability to create a decisive victory over little Finland made it look like a great idea to invade it. And Germany invaded the USSR in June of 1941. The USSR was completely not expecting this. Stalin was completely not expecting this. The war began as a total shambles and complete rout for the Soviet forces. Within a matter of months, German forces had penetrated deep into the Soviet Union. They blockaded Leningrad and had a 900-day siege of Leningrad. They almost captured Moscow, almost captured Stalingrad, but of course we all know what happened at Stalingrad. And the USSR was able to evacuate people and materials beyond the Urals. So it was very convenient that it had this enormous territory, and it evacuated large numbers of people, entire factories, all kinds of stuff beyond the Urals, was able to set up factories in Siberia and start producing key items such as weapons and tanks. And by 1943, they had become so successful at this that they were able to push the German advance back. And by spring of 1945, as we all know, they captured Berlin. And so this ended with total victory for the USSR, but at a tremendously high cost. Approximately 28 million Soviet citizens were killed, according to our best estimates. Again, we don't know exactly how many people died. Record keeping was not something that happened in a very precise way at the time, but probably about 28 million people were killed, or 28 million Soviet citizens were killed. And they had by far the highest death toll of any country in the war. And so this was a victory won at an incredibly high cost. And a major factor in the victory is considered to be national morale. And as part of raising national morale, the persecution of artists was relaxed, and artists were given a lot more leeway in what they could produce in order to bolster the war effort. And so artists such as Anna Akhmatova were suddenly allowed to produce and publish their work as a way of raising national morale. And so it was an absolutely terrible time for the Soviet Union, but at the same time, in many ways, a time of increased freedom and increased national morale. And of course, it's remembered now as this tremendous victory and used as a rallying point for modern Russian citizens.